I remember sitting in the kitchen of the house where I grew up, staring at a photo album my adoptive mother had just pulled from the attic. I was 48 years old, and my whole life I'd been told the same story. I should be grateful. Grateful that they chose me. Grateful that they saved me from foster care. Grateful for every meal, every birthday, every moment I was given a home when I could have had nothing. My adoptive parents were good people. Kind, stable, never made me feel like I wasn't part of the family. But there was always this undercurrent, this subtle reminder that my existence in their home was an act of charity. My mother would say things like, "We picked you because we knew you needed us." Or my father would tell relatives at family gatherings, "We felt called to give him a better life." The words were loving, but they carried weight. They carried obligation. Growing up, I internalized that message completely. My biological family had abandoned me. These people saved me. I owed them everything, and I spent 30 years living with that debt hanging over my head. I was the good son. I called every Sunday. I helped with their mortgage in my 30s. When my dad got sick, I brought flowers on Mother's Day. I was performing gratitude constantly because deep down, I believed that's what I was supposed to do, repay them for choosing me when nobody else wanted me. Then, about a year ago, my adoptive father passed away. It was sudden, a heart attack on a Tuesday morning. He was 72. I grieved him genuinely. He'd been my dad in every way that mattered, but I also felt something else beneath the grief. I felt the weight of unfinished conversations, of questions I'd never asked because I didn't think I had the right to ask them. My mother started organizing his things, and one afternoon she called me over to help sort through boxes in the garage. That's where I found it, a sealed envelope with my name written in my father's handwriting. Inside was a letter and a document I'd never seen before. It was my original adoption papers, but there was something else too. A private investigator's report from 1998, dated just before I turned 5 years old. My hands were shaking as I read the first page. The investigator had found information about my biological family. My mother's name was Eleanor. She'd passed away when I was 2. My father's name was Robert, and he had 3 other children, all older than me. The report included addresses, phone numbers, and something that made my breath catch, a notation about a family trust, a substantial one, millions of dollars. I sat there on the concrete floor of that garage for what felt like hours, rereading those pages over and over. My adoptive father had known. He'd hired someone to investigate my background, and he'd kept it from me. Why? I asked my mother that night, and her answer was careful, measured. She said my dad wanted to protect me, that knowing about money and a family that had given me up would only complicate my life. He wanted me to be happy, she said. He wanted me to feel like I truly belonged to them, but that answer didn't sit right with me. Something felt off. If my biological father was still alive, if there was a substantial family trust, why had I been put up for adoption in the first place? Why hadn't anyone come looking for me? I decided to do something I'd never done before. I decided to look for answers myself. The research took weeks. I hired my own investigator this time, and what came back shattered everything I thought I knew. My biological father, Robert Matthews, was a wealthy real estate developer. He was still alive, 68 years old, and living in Connecticut. He'd never been married to my mother. They'd had an affair when she was working as his personal assistant. When she got pregnant, according to the investigator's notes based on old court documents, there had been a custody battle. My father wanted me. My older siblings, Jessica, Michael, and David, all from his marriage to their mother, Patricia, did not. The investigator found newspaper clippings from local courts. My father had fought hard for custody, but then something changed. The documents showed that he'd suddenly dropped the custody case and agreed to a closed adoption. The timing coincided with a significant change in the family trust structure. Money had been allocated, a settlement had been made, and then I disappeared from the record. I stared at those documents in my apartment, my heart pounding. I'd been bought. My own siblings, people I'd never met, had essentially forced my adoption to keep me away from the inheritance. They'd convinced or pressured their father into giving me up, probably by threatening some kind of family upheaval, and my biological father, rather than fight a custody war that might have destroyed his legitimate family, had taken the money and let me go. For 2 days, I couldn't think about anything else. I couldn't work. I barely slept. I kept reading the same pages, hoping I'd misunderstood something, that there was another explanation. But the math was too clear, the timing was too perfect, the money in that settlement was too substantial to be coincidental. On the 3rd day, I made a decision. I was going to contact my biological father. I needed to hear from him why he'd given me up, why he'd taken money instead of fighting for me. I needed to know if those siblings of mine knew what they'd done, if they understood that they'd essentially erased my existence to protect their inheritance. I found a phone number. It took me an hour to dial it. A woman answered. She had a refined accent, the kind you hear from people who've always had money. I asked for Robert Matthews, and there was a pause, the kind of pause that happens when someone is trying to decide whether to help you or hang up the phone. She told me he was her husband and asked who was calling. I told her my name. I watched my hand shake as I held the phone to my ear. There was silence on the other end. Then she said, "Hold on," and I heard her calling for Robert, my biological father. A man I'd never heard speak, never seen a photograph of, never known existed until 3 days ago. When he picked up the phone, his voice was older than I expected, careful, almost afraid. He said my name like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. I told him I knew. I told him I had the adoption papers, the investigator's report, the court documents. I told him I knew about the settlement, about the money, about how my siblings had wanted me gone. He didn't deny any of it. He just sat there listening, and I could hear him breathing. After what felt like forever, he said, "I've thought about you every day for 43 years. Something inside me broke when he said that. I wasn't expecting him to sound human. I wasn't expecting him to sound regretful. He told me the truth, slowly and carefully. He'd been young when he had me with my mother. He'd wanted custody, had fought for it, but my marriage to Patricia was fragile. His other children, Jessica especially the oldest, had been vicious about it. They'd threatened to destroy him legally, to expose affairs, to make custody battles so expensive and public that he'd lose everything. His business was new then. He didn't have the resources to fight both the custody case and his family's sabotage. And then Patricia, my stepmother, had come to him with an offer. If he gave up custody, if he agreed to a closed adoption, she would convince Jessica and the others to stand down. She'd tell them he'd accepted defeat, that he was moving forward with the family, that there was no threat to the inheritance. The settlement money was supposed to be for my care, he said. He'd insisted on that. He wanted to make sure I was taken care of, even if he couldn't be the one to do it. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. "I thought giving you to a good family, letting you have a clean slate, was better than being born into all of this." His voice cracked when he said the next part. "I didn't know I was abandoning you." I asked him about my siblings. He said Jessica was the CEO of the family business now. Michael was a venture capitalist. David was a lawyer who specialized in estate planning. They were all wealthy, all successful, all built on the foundation of an inheritance that had been protected by my absence. "Do they know?" I asked him. "Do they know what they did?" He said he didn't think so. He said Patricia had kept it quiet, had made it clear that the closed adoption was a family matter that shouldn't be discussed. He said Jessica had mentioned once, years ago, that their father had gotten rid of his illegitimate problem, but he didn't think she understood what she was actually talking about. She didn't know there had been a negotiation, a trade-off, a price tag on my head. I didn't know what to feel, angry, betrayed, relieved that at least my biological father hadn't simply abandoned me, all of it at once. He asked if I wanted to meet him. He said he'd love that he'd wanted that for decades. I told him I needed time, I needed to process this, I needed to figure out who I was now that I knew where I came from. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment for hours, staring at the wall. My whole life had been built on a lie, not the kind of lie where people were intentionally cruel, but the kind where good intentions masked a more uncomfortable truth. My adoptive parents had loved me, yes. But they'd also been complicit in erasing my existence. My biological father had given me up to save his marriage and his business, and my siblings, my own blood, had essentially paid to have me removed from their lives. I thought about my adoptive mother, who'd raised me to believe I should be grateful. I thought about my adoptive father, who'd kept this secret his whole life. I thought about Robert, who'd spent 43 years thinking about a son he'd given away. And I thought about Jessica, Michael, and David, who'd grown up spending money that was supposed to be shared 3 ways, who'd built their lives on a foundation of exclusion. Over the next week, I researched the family trust. It was public record. You can find a lot if you know where to look. The trust was substantial. We're talking tens of millions. The kind of money that doesn't just appear, it accumulates over generations. And according to the documents, if there were more beneficiaries, the distributions would have been split differently. If I'd been included, if I'd never been given up for adoption, my siblings would have received less. I didn't know what to do with that information. Part of me wanted to disappear, to go back to being grateful, to pretend I'd never found those documents. Part of me wanted to walk away from all of it. My adoptive family, my biological family, the whole mess. And part of me wanted to do something about it. I decided to contact my siblings. I wanted to look them in the eye, or at least hear their voices, and understand what they'd done. I wanted to know if they'd carried any guilt about it, if they'd ever thought about the baby brother they'd paid to have erased. Jessica answered her office phone on the second ring. I introduced myself, and I heard her take a sharp breath. She said, "Who gave you this number?" I told her I was her brother, that I'd been adopted at 4, that I'd recently discovered the circumstances of my adoption, and that I wanted to talk to her about it. The line went quiet. Then she said, "I don't know what you're talking about," and she hung up. I tried Michael next. He was more polite but equally dismissive. He said whatever happened 43 years ago was private family business, that I had no claim on the family or the trust, and that if I was calling to ask for money, I could forget it. He told me to stop contacting him and hung up. David was the lawyer, so I expected him to be careful. He was. He asked me questions, methodical questions, trying to figure out what I knew and what I wanted. When I told him I'd seen the original adoption papers and the settlement documentation, he went very quiet. Then he said, "Whatever arrangement was made between your biological father and your adoptive parents was legal and binding. You have no legal recourse here." I told him I wasn't looking for legal recourse. I was looking for answers, for some kind of acknowledgement of what they'd done. "What we did," he said carefully, "was protect our family's interests. Our father made a choice. Your adoption was part of that choice. If you're here to cause problems, we have lawyers who can ensure you don't." That's when I understood something fundamental. They knew, maybe not all the details, maybe not the full picture, but they knew enough, and they didn't care. To them, I was a solved problem, an old complication that had been neatly disposed of decades ago. I hung up the phone feeling something I'd never felt before. I wasn't angry at them for what they'd done. That anger had already started to dissolve into something more complicated. I was angry at myself. I was angry that I'd spent 48 years being grateful for crumbs, for being chosen, for being lucky. I was angry that I'd allowed myself to be positioned as someone who owed gratitude for simply existing. And that's when I realized something else. My adoptive parents had done me a favor in more ways than one. They'd given me a life, yes, but they'd also given me distance. They'd given me the ability to walk away from this mess without the burden of family obligation. My siblings, my biological father, the trust, the inheritance, none of it was actually mine. I'd been given up at 4 years old, and in a way, I'd been free ever since. I just didn't know it until now. I spent the next 2 weeks doing something I'd never done before. I stopped being grateful. I stopped calling my adoptive mother every Sunday. I stopped showing up to family dinners. I didn't answer her texts asking if everything was okay. I know that sounds cold, but I needed space. I needed to understand who I was without the weight of obligation, without the constant reminder that I should be thankful for my existence. My adoptive mother eventually called me directly. She was worried, she said. She wanted to know what was wrong. I told her I knew about the adoption papers, about the investigator's report, about the settlement. I asked her why my father had kept it from me. I asked her why she'd taught me my whole life that I should be grateful to people who'd essentially been transactional about my placement. She cried. She said it wasn't like that they'd loved me genuinely, that my father had just wanted to protect me from complicated feelings. But even as she said those things, I could hear the defensiveness in her voice. She was protecting her own story. The story where they were the heroes, where they'd saved me, where I owed them something indefinable for the rest of my life. I told her I appreciated what she and my father had done, but that I couldn't carry the burden of gratitude anymore. I couldn't be the good son who showed up to prove he deserved to be chosen. I needed to figure out who I was on my own terms. She didn't understand. She asked if I was angry at her, and I realized I wasn't. Not really. I was angry at a system that had positioned me as lucky, as chosen, as obligated, and I was angry at myself for believing it for so long. After that conversation, I made contact with my biological father again. This time it was different. I wasn't calling for answers. I was calling because I wanted to know him, not as a savior or a betrayer, but as a person. We met at a coffee shop in Connecticut, neutral ground, a place where if things went badly, I could just leave. He was sitting at a corner table when I arrived, and the moment I saw him, I knew because I had his eyes, I had his nose, I had the shape of his face. 48 years old, and I was finally looking at someone who shared my biology, my actual blood, and it was overwhelming. He stood up when he saw me, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then he reached out and shook my hand, formal, careful, like he was afraid I might disappear if he moved too quickly. We sat down, and he ordered coffee he didn't drink while we talked. He told me about my mother, Eleanor. He said she was funny, brilliant, ambitious. He said he'd loved her, but it had been complicated because he'd been married. He said when she got pregnant, he wanted to do the right thing, but he didn't know what the right thing was. He said he'd been selfish and cowardly, and that giving me up was the biggest regret of his life. I asked him about his other children. He said Jessica had always been difficult, always protective of her position as the oldest, always worried about being displaced. He said when he'd fought for custody of me, she'd seen it as a threat. Michael had mostly followed Jessica's lead. David had been quieter about it, but he'd gone along with the family consensus. They were scared, Robert said. They thought I was going to split my attention, split my resources. They thought you would somehow diminish what they had, and I let their fear become their truth. I asked him if he'd ever tried to find me after I was adopted. He said he had. In the early years, he'd hired investigators. He'd tried to get information from my adoptive parents through lawyers, but the adoption had been closed, sealed by the courts, and there was nothing he could do legally. Eventually, he'd accepted it. He'd moved on. He'd built a life with Patricia and his other children, but he'd never stopped thinking about me. "Every birthday," he said, "I wondered where you were, what you were doing, if you were happy. I wondered if I made the right choice giving you up." And the answer was always the same: I didn't know. His hands were shaking as he spoke. I could see the weight of decades sitting on his shoulders, all the years of wondering, all the guilt that had probably kept him awake at night. We talked for hours. He told me about his business, about how he'd built it from nothing in the real estate world. He told me about Patricia, who'd been cold but stable, a woman who'd believed in maintaining appearances and protecting family assets. He told me about his grandchildren, my nieces and nephews, who would have no idea I existed. He told me about watching my siblings grow up, about the success they'd achieved, about how that success always felt hollow to him because it had been built on a foundation of excluding me. And I told him about my life. I told him about my adoptive parents, about the career I'd built in finance, about the relationships I'd had and lost, about the emptiness I'd always felt, this sense of not quite belonging anywhere, even in the home that had chosen me. I told him about the Sunday calls and the family dinners and the constant exhausting performance of gratitude. I told him about the nightmares I'd had as a teenager, where I was running through a house looking for a door that didn't exist, searching for something I couldn't name. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he reached across the table and put his hand on my arm. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry for all of it. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder. I'm sorry I let fear win." I didn't know what to say to that. His apology wasn't going to undo 43 years. His regret wasn't going to give me back the childhood I might have had, but his honesty meant something. His willingness to sit with the weight of his mistake meant something. Before I left that day, he asked me if I wanted to be part of his life. He said he understood if I didn't, if it was too complicated or too painful, but he said he'd like the chance to know me, even if it was just occasionally, even if it was just as a friend getting to know another friend. He said he had a few years left, and he didn't want to spend them wondering about me anymore. I told him I needed more time, but for the first time, I didn't feel obligated to give him a specific answer. For the first time in my life, I was making a choice without the weight of gratitude or obligation behind it. Over the next month, I made a decision about my siblings. I decided I was going to contact them one more time, not to ask for acknowledgement or apology, but to tell them something they needed to hear. I wanted them to understand that I existed, that I'd been real, and that their choice to erase me from their lives had consequences, not legal consequences, not financial ones, but human ones. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to be the price of their peace of mind. I wrote Jessica a letter. I wrote it by hand, slowly, taking my time with each word. I told her that I knew what she'd done. I told her I understood why she'd done it. Fear, self-preservation, the desire to protect what was hers, the anxiety that a new sibling would somehow diminish her place in the family hierarchy. I told her I wasn't angry anymore, but I wanted her to know that somewhere in the world, the brother she'd paid to have removed from her life had become a good person despite everything. I told her that her fear had created exactly what she'd been trying to prevent, a complicated family legacy that would eventually fall apart because it was built on lies, on exclusion, on the mistaken belief that love and inheritance were finite resources that had to be protected at any cost. I sent the letter to her office address. She never responded, but about 2 weeks later, I got a call from a lawyer representing the family trust. He said that Jessica, Michael, and David had authorized him to offer me a settlement, a substantial one, enough to secure my future if I wanted it to, enough to make this problem go away permanently. The only condition was a non-disclosure agreement and a promise that I would never attempt to contact them again or reveal the circumstances of my adoption publicly. I laughed when he told me that. I actually laughed out loud for the first time in months. They were still trying to pay me to disappear, even after all these years, even after I'd proven I wasn't a threat to their inheritance, even after I'd simply told them the truth about what they'd done. They still wanted to buy my silence and my absence. They still wanted to transact with me, to reduce me to a problem that could be solved with money. I told the lawyer no. I told him to tell them that I didn't want their money, their silence, or their conditional forgiveness. I told him that I was going to live my life exactly as I saw fit, and if that meant telling my story, then that's what I would do. I told him that the settlement offer was just another form of the same erasure I'd been fighting against my whole life. The lawyer seemed confused. He asked if I was sure, if I wanted to reconsider, if I understood how substantial the offer was. I said I was absolutely sure. I understood exactly how substantial the offer was, and that was precisely why I was refusing it. I hung up the phone and felt something I'd been searching for my whole life. Freedom. Not the kind of freedom that comes from being chosen or saved, but the kind that comes from choosing yourself. Freedom from the obligation to be grateful. Freedom from the need for their validation or their money or their acknowledgement. A year passed. A year of slowly rebuilding my relationship with my adoptive mother on new terms. I told her that I would always love her and my father for raising me, but I couldn't be the grateful child anymore. I could only be her son. She struggled with that at first, couldn't understand why I was pulling away, why I was suddenly angry about things that had happened so long ago. But I explained to her that my anger wasn't about what they'd done. It was about what I'd internalized. I was angry at myself for spending decades apologizing for my own existence, for performing gratitude like it was a script I had to memorize perfectly. We went to therapy together, actually, my adoptive mother and I. It was awkward at first, sitting in a therapist's office, discussing the artificial hierarchy that had been created between us, the idea that I owed her something just for existing in her home. The therapist helped her understand that gratitude, forced from a place of obligation, isn't actually gratitude at all. It's just another form of control. Eventually, my adoptive mother started to cry. She said she'd never thought of it that way. She said she genuinely believed she was loving me by reminding me how lucky I was. But that's not what a parent does, the therapist said gently. A parent loves unconditionally, not transactionally. A parent doesn't remind their child constantly that they should be grateful for basic necessities and a home. That creates shame and obligation, not love. My adoptive mother nodded, and I could see something shift in her. She finally understood that her constant reminders of my luck, my gratitude, my debt to her, all of it had been a way of asserting control, of maintaining power over me. It wasn't intentional cruelty, but it was control nonetheless. After that, things changed between us. She apologized. She said she was sorry for making me feel like I had to earn my place in the family. She said she was sorry for the weight she'd put on me. And more importantly, she started to listen. She let me have feelings about my adoption that didn't fit into the narrative of being lucky or grateful. She let me be angry. She let me be confused. She let me be human. I also began spending time with Robert, my biological father. Not as a son trying to make up for lost time, but as two adults getting to know each other slowly, carefully. We went to dinner at nice restaurants in Connecticut. We took walks along the harbor. We talked about books and business and life and regret. We talked about what might have been if things had been different. We talked about the choices we'd made and the ones that had been made for us. It was awkward sometimes. There were silences that lasted too long, moments where we both seemed to remember that we were essentially strangers tied together by biology and circumstance. But it was real. He never tried to make up for the 43 years he'd missed. He never tried to be a father in the traditional sense. He never tried to buy my affection or my forgiveness. He just tried to be someone I could know, and eventually, that was enough. more than enough. It was everything. He told me about his will. He said he'd changed it to include me. He said he wanted to make sure that when he died, I wouldn't be left with nothing while my siblings inherited everything. I told him I didn't need his money, that I hadn't come into his life for an inheritance. But he said it wasn't about need. It was about acknowledgement. It was about him finally, after all these years, claiming me as his son in the way he should have claimed me at birth. I never took the settlement money that Jessica, Michael, and David had offered. I built my own life, my own career, my own financial security through years of work and discipline. And I realized that in refusing their money, I'd broken the cycle. I'd stopped being transactional. I'd stopped being someone who could be bought or sold or exchanged for convenience. I was no longer the price tag on a family conflict. I was a person. About 18 months after I first found those adoption papers, I did something that terrified me. I decided to tell my story publicly, not to hurt anyone, not to expose my siblings or my biological father or my adoptive parents, but because I realized that my story wasn't just mine anymore. My story was about millions of people who've been adopted, who've been told their whole lives to be grateful for their existence, who've internalized the idea that they owe something to the people who chose them. I started writing about it. I wrote essays for major publications. I gave interviews. I wrote about what it felt like to discover that I'd been given up not out of necessity, but out of choice. I wrote about the weight of gratitude and how it had kept me small, how it had prevented me from having authentic emotions about the people who raised me. I wrote about learning to choose myself, even when it meant disappointing the people who'd raised me, even when it meant breaking the carefully constructed narrative they'd built around my adoption. The response was overwhelming. People reached out from all over the world. They told me their own adoption stories. They told me about the complicated feelings they'd always carried about being chosen. They told me about the guilt they felt for having negative emotions about their adoption. They told me that my story had given them permission to feel angry, to feel confused, to feel betrayed, to stop being grateful and start being honest about what their adoptions had actually cost them emotionally. Adoptees who'd spent their whole lives trying to be perfect, trying to prove they deserved to be chosen, suddenly gave themselves permission to be messy and human. Parents who'd been using gratitude as a tool of control started to question whether they were creating healthy relationships or just perpetuating cycles of obligation. The conversation spread. It grew. It became something bigger than just my family's story. Jessica, Michael, and David never publicly responded to anything I said. But I heard through Robert that Jessica had finally told the rest of the family the full truth about the adoption and the settlement. He said there had been arguments, guilt, a reckoning of sorts. He said David had specifically asked Robert why he hadn't fought harder to keep me, and Robert had told him the truth because he'd been afraid, just like they were. He said his fear had cost him a son, and their fear had cost them a brother. Fear, Robert told them, was the most expensive currency there was. That reconciliation wasn't mine to have, and that was okay. I didn't need my siblings to apologize or acknowledge what they'd done. I needed them to exist in my story as a reminder of why I'd had to learn to choose myself. Their rejection, their negotiation, their settlement offer, all of it had pushed me towards something real, toward authenticity, toward the understanding that I didn't need to be grateful to exist. The inheritance remained untouched by me initially. My siblings kept their wealth, my biological father kept his business, my adoptive parents kept their memory of being saviors. But something shifted in the family dynamics. Robert started to include me in family business discussions. He wanted my opinion. He wanted my perspective. And though Jessica and Michael and David were uncomfortable with my presence, they couldn't really object without revealing everything that had been hidden for so long. I became a consultant to the family business for a time. I helped them restructure some of their real estate operations. I brought a fresh perspective, an outside eye that could see inefficiencies they'd been living with for years. And I was paid fairly for my work, not as a relative being done a favor, but as a professional doing a job well. Years later, I would understand that my adoption had been a transaction, but not the one everyone believed. The transaction wasn't between my adoptive parents and the adoption agency. The transaction was between my siblings and my biological father, a trade where fear had been the currency and I'd been the price. But that transaction had also freed me from a debt I never should have owed. When Robert died, 5 years after I'd first found those adoption papers, I inherited more than just money. I inherited legitimacy. I inherited my place in the family history, even if some members of that family still refuse to acknowledge it. My siblings fought the will initially, but their lawyer advised them that they didn't have legal grounds to challenge it. Robert had been clear about his intentions. He had been of sound mind. He had wanted me to have what he'd left behind. I used that inheritance to establish a foundation for adoptees. I used it to fund research into adoption practices, to support therapy for people struggling with complicated feelings about their adoption, to create scholarships for adopted kids going to college. I took the money that had been intended to erase me, and I used it to make sure that no other adoptee would feel as alone as I had felt. I was no longer the lucky child who'd been chosen. I was the man who'd chosen himself, and that, I finally understood, was infinitely more valuable than any inheritance, any settlement, any gesture of gratitude forced from people who'd never fully wanted me in their lives. My story didn't have the ending everyone expected. There was no dramatic reveal where my siblings suddenly loved me and we became a real family. There was no moment where my biological father made up for lost time by becoming the perfect dad. There was no windfall, no justice in the traditional sense, no villain getting what they deserved. What I got instead was something quieter and more powerful. I got the truth and I got freedom. I got the ability to love the people in my life because I chose to, not because I felt obligated to. And I discovered that for someone who'd spent his whole life learning to be grateful for scraps, learning to apologize for existing, learning to make himself smaller to fit into other people's narratives, the real wealth wasn't money or family recognition or a place at the table. It was the knowledge that I was enough, exactly as I was, chosen or not, wanted or not, inherited or not. I was enough because I chose to be. I was enough because I finally, after all those years, stopped asking permission to exist. That choice changed everything.